Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here early this morning. My name is Rafe Sonnenschein. I'm the Executive Director of the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs at Cal State LA. And I welcome you here on behalf of the Pat Brown Institute, Cal State LA, and our wonderful partners, the Center for California Studies at Sacramento State, and the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles. This is going to be quite a day, we think. I think quite an interesting and engaging day. And I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this conference. It actually began with a proposal from the president of my university, Bill Covino, who, in thinking about the future of higher education, asked if the Pat Brown Institute might have a role to play in fostering dialogue. And of course, that is right up the alley of the Pat Brown Institute. Our goal is to foster debate and discussion on critical issues, to advance the way people think about things, but not just to have airy pie-in-the-sky meetings that don't lead to anything. As my predecessor, Jaime Regalado, often told me, Pat Brown used to say to Jaime, don't do pie-in-the-sky stuff that doesn't lead to anything. He had a very great reverence for higher education and at the same time a worry that we weren't going to talk about important things. And if there's one thing we're dedicated to at the Pat Brown Institute, it's carrying out that vision of bringing the best thinking, but always in the direction of action. And that's what we're going to do. We reached out to Steve Boilard of Sacramento State, the Center for California Studies Executive Director, and have been doing many things together, but one of the things we decided is to set up a two-part conference. And the first part, which is today, is to lay the groundwork, generate ideas, and sort of get the ball rolling. But many people leave these conferences feeling that nothing has come of it, a lot of good ideas, but there's no outcome. But Steve will be hosting a conference in Sacramento, probably in October, that will be part two, that will take many of the ideas that are generated today and bring them to public policy decision makers and others in Sacramento. So I think you can see that our commitment is very much in line with Pat Brown's idea of linking thought, discussion, and action. And we're very excited about all the different ways this is going to go. As you can see, we have a very diverse audience, and I'm particularly happy how many students we have here today. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and we welcome you and hope this will be of interest to everybody. There's a few people for me to thank. One is the staff of the Pat Brown Institute, whom some of you have met already. Raquel Beltran is our associate director. Lily Baba, where is Lily? Is she? She's out outside, as she always is, taking care of everything. Nicole Hernandez, our new communications coordinator. Montserrat and Joanna, are you here? Okay, there they are, out there too, right? And our number of volunteers, Deanna, who's working in our office as a volunteer as well. We also would like to thank Edison International, which on an annual basis supports events like this by supporting our public policy education program. And we'd like to acknowledge their support. The way the day will go is we're going to have an opening panel on the history of the master plan to give us a foundation. And our belief is that without history, there's no way to know how to go forward without knowing where we've been and how we got to this point. And maybe that's a little bit different from the way a lot of conferences have gone on higher education, but we think that that perspective is going to add a great deal to our ability to think ahead. We'll take a short break after that panel, just 15 minutes, then we'll go to the next panel, which will be much more contemporary with people talking about what our alternatives are. And then after lunch, we'll have a panel of 3 top advisors to state elected officials in the area of higher education who will give us their perspective on everything that's been said so far and where we might go from here. Following that, there will be a coffee and dessert reception, and we urge you to hang around and just chat and sort of keep the conversation going. I'd also like to bring up now our 2 co-sponsors, one at a time, which is Steve Boilard and Brenda Riddick. Steve, again, is not only the executive director of the Center for California Studies, but spent many years in the Legislative Analyst's Office in Sacramento, where he became one of the state's leading experts on higher education. He's been a great partner for me, and Steve, I'd like you to come up and say a few words.
Well, thank you. And I appreciated being able to go around the room. That was off script, but it's helpful to understand the kind of audience we have. It's a wonderful audience. Unfortunately, it means I'm going to have to cut back my 30 minutes of opening remarks to 2 minutes, and I'll just hit the highlights. As Rafe mentioned, I'm with the Center for California Studies at Sacramento State. The Center for California Studies has a mission of strengthening democratic governance in California. Very broad mission, but we do it in a number of ways. Probably the one we're best known for is we run the Capital Fellows programs, and I certainly encourage the students here to be thinking about that as a possibility. The Capital Fellows programs take college graduates and place them in one-year paid positions in one of the 3 branches of state government. And the way, that's created as a way to try and improve democracy by increasing staff capacity in the public sector. It's really a very robust program, and it's kind of the flagship program we run. But we do a number of other projects and programs, and one of these projects is this conference today. And as Rafe mentioned, we at the Center for California Studies have a very close working relationship with the Pat Brown Institute. Really excited to be doing this conference with them, as well as with the League of Women Voters, who's also very well represented here in the audience. I think that it's obvious that higher education is essential to the strength of our democracy. A lot of people, when they talk about higher education, a lot of the conversations are about the kind of economic impact of it, but I think it's important that we think about how important education is to the strength of the democracy and informed citizenry. So it's a critical issue that we're discussing today for the future of our state. As Rafe mentioned, this is not intended to be the final word. We really just want you to be thinking outside of the box. We want to get a lot of stuff on the table, and we'll look forward to having as many of you as possible up in Sacramento this fall for part 2 of the conference. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. I'd like to introduce Brenda Riddick. And before I do, just to indicate that in the last few years, the relationship of the Pat Brown Institute to the League of Women Voters has become just really a profound relationship. We have been conducting debates together for political candidates. We've done issue forums. And on almost everything we do now, we think, what would the League do, and where could we work together with the League? So we just hope that this continues for the years to come. And with that in mind, let me introduce Brenda.
Good morning to all, and I'm so impressed to see so many of the League of Women Voter members here from different chapters. I am from the Los Angeles chapter. I currently am part of, well, I guess I chair the Higher Education Study Committee, where the League is taking a position in the near term to look at what we need to do with higher education, and that's why we're all here today, to talk about the master plan that was and where we're going in the future. So it is really important to the League that we debate on issues that are relevant to society, to our citizens, to our communities, and as part of that, being from the Women's League voters, we want to make sure that not just women are involved, but everyone is involved to the extent that you have a stake in the community, you have a stake in education, you have a stake in what's going to happen with the economy of this state, as well as the country and then globally. So I'm so thankful to have all of you come out so early this morning and participate in this activity. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask me or engage me. I'm also at Cal State Dominguez Hills, which you heard. I'm the director for the Mervyn M. Dimely African American Political and Economic Institute, and so we also are engaged in the effort of higher education and furthering that in our communities. So I thank you very much for your time.
At this time, we're going to begin our program with a segment of a wonderful film that was directed by Sasha Rice that I've seen many times and I never get tired of it. It's about the life and career of Pat Brown. And with Sasha's permission, we've created a 5-minute segment, which she's donated the screening rights for us to do, just on Pat Brown, higher education, and the master plan. So enjoy and watch this film, and then we'll go right to our first panel discussion.
Grandpa and I didn't talk a lot about his childhood, but after some searching, I uncovered an amazing collection of old recordings.
It was kind of a tough neighborhood. You had to be able to handle your dukes in those days. So my father, he was kind of a boxer, and he kind of taught me to box, so I became a pretty good fighter. My mother, she was self-educated, and she would read history to us. I had enough recommendations to go to college, but my father was having financial difficulties. But I didn't want to tell him I didn't have enough money. I wanted to let him think I was stupid.
He often talked about how he had never gone to college, but I didn't realize it was because he couldn't afford it.
He'd gone straight from high school to law school, something you couldn't do today, but you could then.
Not having taken English or history in college, I've always suffered from somewhat of an inferiority complex with college people. But I just had that political bug from the very, very beginning.
Pat Brown won by a landslide. And with all the power of a million-vote victory, the new governor decided to tackle an issue that was close to his heart.
The higher educational system was in chaos. There was very clearly a substantial increase in population. There was no planning being done. It was just a situation which was out of control.
And Pat just grabbed a hold of it, said, we've got to do something about this.
So far as the governor can stop it, there will never be a tuition at the University of California or the state colleges or the junior colleges of our land, believe me.
He knew that it was obligatory for California to lay down the foundations for the mega state that it was becoming.
Pat Brown set out to level the playing field in education for Californians, supporting an idea which became known as the Master Plan for Higher Education.
We have the statistics to prove that in other states where they have high tuition, some of the best students just don't go on to college. But the young man or the young woman that finishes state college or a university over a period of 10 years doubles the income of the person that drops out in high school.
Pat came into office and pushed for a solution. He told the people who ran the universities, either you guys solve this or the legislature and I will solve it, and we may solve it in a way that you won't like. He and Clark Kerr, who was then the president of the university, had a bit of a touchy relationship at first, and Pat acknowledged that in part it was because he was a little nervous around people who were very well educated, as Clark was.
The governor entrusted Clark Kerr to be the architect of the master plan.
Governor Brown, in effect, sort of quarterbacked all these moves through the Assembly, through the Senate, through the academic world.
Pat's most important role was in coming up with the money to build new campuses, 3 new university campuses, 8 new state college campuses, countless new community colleges. And they kept the tuition low enough so that working class kids, like Pat had once been, could go to public universities that were the best public education system in the world.
Because our competitiveness as a nation, much of it all depends on the education of our people, and that was a very high priority for him.
They said the way out is through education. It benefited me greatly, the master plan. UCLA was $40 a semester.
Today, campuses are erupting with protests because students cannot afford college. They're even holding funerals for the master plan.
We've cut tens of millions from higher education. What we're experiencing now has been a devastating blow to education. For some reason today, people feel as though they want the best, but they don't really want to pay for it.
I think he'd be dismayed beyond belief. He felt so strongly about the importance of an affordable education to make it accessible to all and of the highest quality.
I'm very proud of the things we're doing in higher education, and we're ahead of the rest of the nation 25 years.
My grandfather often expressed regret that he never went to college, but he delighted in making that opportunity possible for all Californians.
Nicole, thank you for the wonderful editing job that Nicole Hernandez did of this. We're now going to bring up our panel. So would you all come up, and then I'll introduce the moderator. The moderator will take it from there, and you can see your spots are all identified up here. And while you're coming up, I just want to tell all panelists today that there's nothing wrong with 2 words, I disagree. I know people feel that it's very important at all times to be as polite as possible, and politeness is generally good, but disagreement brings just as much to the table as agreement. And I've told that to the moderators, and everybody should know that we would really like to hear lots of back and forth and lots of points of view. And to be our first moderator, Jim Newton, who many of you know is one of the leading journalistic citizens of the city of Los Angeles, was for many years the editor of the editorial pages of the Los Angeles Times, supervised the op-ed page, the Sunday Opinion, letters to the editor. He's been a reporter, editor, and bureau chief, covered the LAPD, he covered Mayor Reardon, and I recall very well that he wrote some of the best columns about Los Angeles charter reform in the late 1990s, which he followed very, very closely. He previously had reported for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and at the New York Times, where he worked for James Reston as an assistant, if any of you remember the legendary James Reston. He graduated from Dartmouth College, has won many awards, covered the earthquake, the LA riots of '92, for which the Times won Pulitzer Prizes. But he is also an author. He's actually now quite a distinguished historian. Most relevant for today is his book, Justice for All, Earl Warren and the Nation He Made, and I highly recommend that you look at any of the books he's written. He's a marvelous biographer, and he has now deserted the Los Angeles Times. He has left to go to UCLA. It's a huge loss for the Times, but a wonderful thing for the university community. He is now a full-time member of the Faculty in Communication Studies at UCLA and is running a new and exciting journal at the Luskin School of Public Affairs called Blueprint. The first issue is already out. It's excellent, focused on criminal justice, and it'll be coming out on a regular basis. But it's all consistent with Jim's career as one of the great thought and opinion leaders of Los Angeles, historically and contemporary terms. So Jim, thank you so much for playing this role, and I turn the electronic gavel over to you.
Well, that was fun. Thank you. First of all, welcome all of you to today's panel, first panel of the morning. Thank you, of course, to Rafe for organizing, for all of you for being here, and to the library for hosting. We're looking forward to an interesting and instructive day, and we're looking forward to kicking it off with you here momentarily. And I'm happy to begin with a really perfect panel to provide the context for today's conversations. We have 3 people here who know the master plan and its history intimately as participants, as historians, and in one case, of course, as a relative of its principal backer, Governor Pat Brown. Briefly then, let me introduce you to our distinguished panelists. On the far end there, Dr. William Pickens has devoted his career to administrative leadership, policy analysis, and action in higher education. He began his career as a junior staff analyst with the California Post-Secondary Education Commission. That's an organization you're about to hear quite a bit more about. In 1975, he served as Associate Vice President for Administration at Sacramento State and as a chancellor of a set of small colleges which specialized in digital arts and engineering. And from 1996 to 2000, he was the executive director of the California Citizens Commission on Higher Education. To his immediate right, Dr. Levier, am I getting that right? David Levier, who spent more than 45 years teaching, researching, managing, as well as providing policy leadership to public and private colleges and universities, as well as consulting with businesses and educational institutions. He spent 6 years with the California Post-Secondary Education Commission. See, I told you you'd hear more about it. And since we're here today to discuss the California Master Plan for Higher Education, it's worth noting that he has been implementing and reviewing the progress of that plan for 40-some years. And to his immediate right, Dr. Charles Ratliff, who spent 35 years in post-secondary education in a variety of areas. He had only just retired when he was called back to serve as the special trustee for the Compton Community College District. He served for a time as Chief Deputy Director of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, yet again, a position that made him responsible for long-range planning and coordination of all colleges and universities in the state of California. Throughout his long career, Dr. Ratliff has been a zealous advocate for educational opportunity and success. And finally, my fellow non-doctor on the panel, Sasha Rice, whose film clip you just saw, is an Emmy-nominated filmmaker, a public speaker, teacher, consultant, and, as you know, granddaughter of former California Governor Pat Brown. In addition to her work as a filmmaker, Ms. Rice is the founder of WOW Writing International, which offers writing workshops, consulting, and mentoring for writers of all ages. Ms. Rice is the president of Fire of Life Films, and she serves on the board of advisors of the Pat Brown Institute. She studied at the American Film Institute and received a Bachelor of Arts from Hampshire College. Those are our panelists. Welcome, all of you. I thought we'd start with you, Sasha, just because you really bring us to the family perspective on this. We've seen your clip. Talk a little bit, if you would, about your grandfather and his thinking about education and what you learned about him in the course of your work in terms of the master plan.
That's a great question. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel. I feel like I should have interviewed all three of you for my documentary.
There's always a sequel.
Right, exactly. This was probably the most important issue for my grandfather, education. The other key issue he was really passionate about was water. He felt, though, that education was really the cornerstone of everything else, and that to have a functioning democracy, an engaged democracy, you needed to have a space where a diverse population was being educated. And so for him, the vision for the master plan was to allow for anybody, regardless of sort of which direction they wanted to go and their financial means, could have that opportunity. And as you saw in the clip, he didn't get to go to college, and that was something he talked about a lot. And what I discovered making the film, which was a really big surprise to me, was that it was because he didn't have enough money. And not only did he not, want his father to know that they couldn't afford to send him to college, but he, throughout his life, always said, well, I just wasn't that smart. And he would rather, his pride was such that he'd rather people think that he wasn't that bright rather than not being able to afford it. And I found that really interesting, and it really shed light onto why he was so passionate about that master plan and fighting for that. In our family, it was always a conversation of where are you going to go to college, and he couldn't understand anybody who wouldn't want to go to a UC or Cal State school. That just baffled him. So anyway, I'm sure I'll have more to say, but that's a little insight.
Did all four of his children end up going to a UC or Cal State school?
No.
No?
Yeah, no. So not everybody did. Yeah, my mother defected and went to Stanford, so that was really scandalous in our household.
Just as a way of sort of setting the table here, I thought we would take a moment to really talk about, each of you, any of you, what the master plan did, so that we all kind of know we're talking the same language here. Any of you can pick that up. Dr. Piggins, you want to start?
Well, it's very important to understand exactly what the situation was back then, and the film used the word chaos. That is exactly what it was. There were campuses proposed all over. Their tuition was talked about. It was a very, very chaotic time. And what the master plan did, both then and in subsequent years, because it was an evolving plan, was as follows. A space for every undergraduate student would be available. A space would be available for every undergraduate student. No tuition would be charged, meaning the cost of instruction, and student fees would only be for auxiliary services, not the cost of instruction and not student financial aid. Each segment would be funded for its particular mission and should strive for excellence within colleges or universities with that mission. The University of California, of course, was the premier research university. The California State Colleges back then were primarily teachers' institutions, professional institutions, and the California Junior Colleges, as they were called back then, was a hodgepodge, a collection of highly dysfunctional, though not necessarily for their reasons, but highly dysfunctional entities that had grown out of the high schools. But they were critical for that because most of the students that were guaranteed this place were going to begin with the California community colleges because it was required that UC and USC and CSU have only 40% at the lower division and 60% at the upper division level.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by that 40 and 60?
That means that, for my colleagues can help me on this.
Sorry.
Of their total undergraduate enrollment, 40% at UC and the state colleges be at the lower division level, meaning the community colleges would have the most. So that was one of the major parts. The California state colleges were clustered underneath a governing board. Prior to that, they'd only been under the State Department of Education, which certainly that was not their primary mission. And then, in addition to that, and I think one of the most not really looked at nearly enough is that there was a student financial aid fund that was set up specifically to help those students who sought education in private colleges and universities. So that was, California was the first state, I believe, in 1955, to set that up and to make it officially part of its master plan. The main thing was that all of these things were set in place. Now later on, CPEC was created. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We had faculty salaries coming at public universities that we set at the highest. We wanted them, at least while I was at CPEC, to be among the highest in the nation. Educational opportunities would be geographically convenient. And the community colleges would provide that. But the bottom line is the master plan for higher education brought together, after a period of terrific chaos, we'll talk a little bit about it, a set of commitments on behalf of the people of California and behalf of the institutions of California concerning access, concerning quality, and concerning choice. And those, well, we'll find out, I guess, later whether those have been met or not.
If I may piggyback on some of what we saw in this excellent movie, but also pick up on some of the things that Bill mentioned. When everybody speaks about the master plan, this book is the master plan as proposed by the study committee. These 5 pages of legislation is actually what the master plan in statute was. And there's a big difference, not just in size, but also in what was recommended in the master plan study and what, in fact, ended up in legislation.
It's fairly amazing that the whole thing can boil down to 5 pages. I mean,
exactly. The reference to chaos, I'd like to expand a little bit and also bring in some of the names that are, excuse me, extremely important that were involved in the master plan. And one of my biases, and others will disagree, but I would argue that historical revisionists basically speak primarily of Clark Kerr as being the architect and the promoter and so forth. The fact of the matter is there were many other people heavily involved, and I'm not minimizing or denigrating the role of Clark Kerr. What I am suggesting, and this spells it out very quickly, is the important role and some of his staff played in moving things along at critical points. As Bill said, and has been said in the movie, there was chaos. Let me give a little bit bigger picture of that chaos. And there's parallels between the 1950s, late 50s, and the 2015s, or this century. The community colleges that existed wanted to be more like the state university. The state university wanted to be more like the University of California. And you need to remember that organizationally, from a governance standpoint, the junior colleges and the state colleges were all under the Board of Education. And the head of the superintendent of public instruction was Roy Simpson, who played a role. and then there was the K-12 on the other side. There was also additional chaos that legislators in California, everybody wanted a college or university in its own backyard. One of the first things that got everybody's attention, particularly Clark Kerr and the University of California, was the promotion and legislation proposal to put a state college in Turlock. Why? Because they had more turkeys, and I don't mean this in a joking way, and they felt they were very important and needed some attention.
They needed to educate turkeys.
There was also something else going on in the country that impacted what was chaotic, and that was the House Un-American Activities was looking very closely at not only Clark Kerr, but also some certain students at Berkeley, and that was antagonizing the governing board, the Board of Regents for the University of California, who were upset that there was so much attention and the federal government was concerned of all this upheaval and so forth. And in fact, Pat Brown, and I expect you're familiar with this part, when he was running for office, before he got elected, he could not go on any University of California campus because the board didn't want anybody who was running on a UC campus. And this is from some oral histories of people that were very much involved. And by the way, if you want to get more than you ever wanted to know, but if you wanted to see the oral histories of many of the people involved in the formulation, if you will, of the master plan and so forth, both in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley and at the archives at Cal State, where are they? Cal State Dominguez Hills, an oral history of all of these players was done by Judd Grenier, famous and friend at Dominguez Hills. He did many of the oral histories with all the people before they passed on. Other people that were very important in all of this, and his name doesn't come up except for those of us who were involved with CSU an awful lot, and that was the role of Glenn Dumpke. Clark Kerr had, when he spoke, he had the power of the University of California, which, by the way, is in the Constitution back from 1859 or 63, someplace back there. That was before my time. Some would argue that point. Glenn Dumpke was the president of San Francisco State. San Francisco, the faculty, he was fairly new. Simpson decided to appoint him as representing the state college interests. Very important. Malcolm Love was president of San Diego State at that time. Malcolm Love was very aggressive in wanting the state colleges not only to have its own board, but also to have a constitutional reference, if you will. And the unification of the state colleges back then, in terms of all the presidents, most of them were all on very different pages. The State Board of Education and Roy Simpson as superintendent also had some difficulty with one another. Simpson tended to operate in his own world, and board members were sometimes would acquiesce. An important member of that was Louis Hebron, who was appointed to the state board, and at the time, just before the signing of the legislation, the Donahoe Act, He was the chair of the state board. Another important person is Dorothy Donahoe. She was a Republican from in the Assembly, and she was from Bakersfield. She became the chair of the Assembly Education Committee. Another person that was very important was George Miller. Yes, the father of the former now, I guess, congressman from Contra Costa County, I believe it is. He became the chair of the Senate Education Committee. Those people, among others, certainly Pat Brown, as I've mentioned. There's also a fellow by the name of Don Leifer, who Pat Brown actually hired away from San Diego State to be his educational advisor, although that wasn't his title. And he represented Pat Brown in many of the behind-the-scenes activities. There are others.
Can I interrupt for just one moment to ask the question? Am I right that both houses of the legislature were controlled by Republicans at the time?
I don't believe so, but I'm not sure.
Okay. It sounds like at least the Assembly must have been if Donahoe was a Republican, right? I mean, so this was, I asked the question really just to raise the question of the bipartisanship behind this proposal. It sounds like there was broad support but from both Republicans and Democrats for the master plan. Is that correct?
It was also really regional. I mean, I think that it was every, like, I think it was Bill who said everybody wanted it in their own backyard. So at the higher education level, everyone was sort of against each other, it felt like.
I thought the most interesting fact, talk about a factoid, was Pat Brown was treated the same way that Mario Savio was. You couldn't come on campus and discuss politics. Mario Savio was the founder of the free speech movement. I'm sure
Riffing
most
a little
of
bit. Dr. Radcliffe, you want to add something here?
Well, I can add a few comments. My colleagues here give you the details. And where I looked at the master plan, I was asking why. You know, because I'm just wondering, you know, California, University of California in particular, had a national reputation of being high quality. And the chaos that I began to look into was that the other colleges and universities in the state had mission envy. They wanted to be as well respected and loved as the University of California, and they kept trying to do what they were doing. And where much of the bipartisanship came in is that during the 50s, California was also experiencing massive growth. You know, with our World War II people beginning to come in, and we were getting, the baby boomers were beginning to have multiple children. We began to have immigration into the state. And because our legislators were looking at our economic foundation, they really attributed our foundation largely to the product, as a product, I should say, of our colleges and universities. We produce great thinkers who could go in and create new economic sectors, and they can contribute to existing economic sectors. And so what they wanted to do is broaden access to post-secondary education in the state as it grew. And they wanted to produce more colleges and more campuses. And one of the things that promoted the growth in physical sites was that the early conversation talked about, if we are serious about trying to get access to our college and university, we need to make them available within 30 minutes of commuting. And that's why we had so many of the community colleges. But we also had folks in there who had the talent of Bill Pickens. They were great financial specialists, and they began looking at how much money are we contributing to support the University of California. And people want to go there. If all these new people went to the university, it's going to cost us millions and billions of dollars. We need to try and redirect them to some of these other sectors that cost us less money, but also get good quality education. They could end up getting degrees from the University of California. And part of what they began doing is saying, well, how can we do that? Well, let's direct the biggest portion to our community college, our junior colleges. I have to get one of the things I always tease them about is that we learned that we need to be well-spoken. And we didn't have community colleges there. We had junior colleges, and their job was to cover the first 2 years of a baccalaureate degree educational program. And then when you did that effectively, you could transfer over to a state college or University of California and earn a degree at one of these well-respected universities. And so we began looking at funneling huge amounts into our junior colleges, where we put far less general fund money than we put into our state colleges and our University of California. And those factors really began to say, if we want to have the 7th largest economy in the world or the 6th largest economy in the world, we can't rely just on the University of California.
Mm-hmm.
And Republicans supported it, Democrats supported it, independents supported it. So it wasn't just about one partisan group.
Mm-hmm.
They came together and used the best minds that they had. How can we as a state do this? Provide access and make sure we get high quality. And by calling it junior colleges, it meant that our junior colleges need to be collaborating, or at least cooperating, with our University of California and our state colleges, so that when they finished the first 2 years, they were able to transfer over.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did that kind of planning to try and make sure that the students that we directed more into our community colleges would get good quality training, and then they would be ready to go and be accepted at the state colleges and the University of California.
Were there sources of opposition to this plan? Where, I mean, we've talked about the politics a little bit and bipartisanship. Where was the pushback in this?
If I may, interesting enough, Clark Kerr wanted to ensure that the constitutional autonomy of the University of California was protected, that they would be the sole provider of the doctor's degree of professionals and professional schools and the primary research institution in the state.
Mm-hmm.
Glenn Dumpke wanted similar language in the Constitution as the University of California. And the pushback was by Pat Brown and Dorothy Donahoe and George Miller. And it was in a very private meeting in Pat Brown's office. And by the way, some of the historians have it occurring someplace else and indicating that Pat Brown didn't have anything to do with it. Don Leifer has his notes. Basically, Stern and Donahoe said, there is no way that we will pass the bill that had come out of the legislature that has CSU and the junior colleges in it. And Pat Brown said, I will, and this was at the 11th hour, he said, I will not sign the bill unless it comes out. He said, we cannot, as a state, look short-term. We have to look long-term to the future of the state. George Miller had proposed, had other language that, by the way, this is the Senate Bill 33 that basically was passed, was really done by George Miller and his staff. During the weekend after that meeting, Dorothy Donahoe died. She had been ill and she died of pneumonia, I believe it was. And Miller and the governor said it will be known as the Donahoe Act, not the Miller Act. That's what happened.
The major pushback, though, frankly, was from those legislators and others who wanted campuses in their district. And that really was the big political issue at the time. And the way that was dealt with was the Donahoe Act put in there that there would not be approval of a new campus without the approval of what was called the Coordinating Council for Higher Education, which was set up in the Act to really sort of oversee the growth, the physical growth of higher education. And that was very controversial at the time. And it proved to be probably one of the most important elements of the master plan.
And how did the members of that body get selected?
They were the heads of the segments, if to use the term. They were the heads of the segments. So it was basically the higher education leaders.
There were 23 bills in the pipeline at that time, most of them for new campuses up and down the state.
Makes sense.
I would say just a short anecdote about when my grandfather was governor. The Watts riots happened, which was so significant and an eye-opener for him. And he went down and he visited Watts. He saw the destruction, and he saw. He heard what people were saying, that we need jobs, and he thought, well, before job comes education. And there was a Cal State campus slated to be in Palos Verdes, and he said it's going to Dominguez Hills. So that was a really controversial choice for him to make at that time. But looking back, we can see how correct that was. But I think that whenever an election came, you were looking at, people wanted these universities and Cal State schools right there. So
right. In your film clip we saw, there's a suggestion, more than a suggestion, of a bit of a tense relationship between Governor Brown and Clark Kerr. Can you elaborate some on that? I think it's Ethan Rarick is quoted in there saying that some of it's just your grandfather's uneasiness about not having an education or a college education.
Yeah.
Is there more to it than that, or what's?
I think it was really what it says in the film. He really felt a bit inferior. He didn't have a doctorate degree, let alone a college degree.
Yeah, right.
So he was always feeling that he was sort of not part of that club, and wasn't sure about his vocabulary even, and was so smart. And his mother read to him just all the great works, and he pursued that on his own. But it's interesting, when he was going through these different negotiations, even before that, whenever he would go and he'd visit a campus, my grandmother would say, lock up the checkbook to his staff, because he always wanted to give to the universities. It was, so he did have a soft spot, even though he was uncomfortable.
It's funny, it's hard to imagine him being insecure. He seems like such a big personality,
Right.
and yet this seems like a little chink in his armor.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting. All of you had an affiliation with the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, and so I really would be interested in getting your thoughts on the sort of the rise and eventual disappearance of the commission and its role in this history. You want to start, Dr. Ratcliffe?
I'd be happy to start, because part of the personal benefits of serving with the commission is it moved me from talking about and thinking about individual students to thinking about the entire state of California. Because that was what the commission was created to do, is to find out how our post-secondary sector could be used to promote the need for education and training beyond high school for all Californians. And so it taught me to ask different kinds of questions. It taught me to look at data and become a fairly decent analyst. Then it taught me how to tell people about numbers in a way that they would understand. So I really benefited from that. And then I believe that the rest of the legislature also was a beneficiary of the activities of CPAC, because they got not just numbers, they got an analysis that said these numbers suggest the following challenges. And we would like to offer the following options that you can consider to address those challenges and continue to move forward in addressing the goals that you have for this state in post-secondary education. So that was one of the real strengths of the commission. And the other comparison I would make, and I'll let some of the others comment, because the UC taught me to be long-spoken, is that one of the advantages they saw is that the CPEC would be a nonpartisan group that looked at information about the achievements and the needs for post-secondary education. They would not be an entity out there just trying to figure out how to attract more money to their system. And the original coordinating council for higher education, made up of the president of UC, the chancellor of the community colleges, the chancellor of they were looking to give information not about negatives of their systems, just the positives, so they can attract more money from the general fund appropriated to their particular systems.
Sounds like a lobbying organization.
Correct. And so CPEC was a real positive change from the CCHE. And that's where there was a good deal of respect there. And then they began to address one of the charges that was given to them, which is a long-term planning. Put together a 5-year plan, and then every year renew that. They also were charged with the responsibility of looking at the request from each of our, the term that was used at the time, each of our segments, for new physical facilities, for new academic programs that we want general fund money to support, salaries to attract the brightest minds in the world, not just the best folks in California. And CPEC then was to look at those requests, do the analysis, and then go to the legislature and the governor and say, based on the empirical data that we have available to us, we believe this is a good request. We think this is a modest request. We think this is a poor request. And here's why. And that allowed the legislature to make decisions, what we would call informed decisions, about the request from the various segments at that time.
And did the
for general
commission
fund
report
appropriations.
directly to the legislature?
Beg your pardon?
Did the commission report to the legislature?
Directly to the legislature.
Huh, interesting.
Yes.
Especially the fiscal committees, especially when issues of finance came up. If I might, he has provided an excellent summary of that. I came to SAPEC in '75, as you mentioned, as a junior staff analyst, right after it had been created, and 3 years before Proposition 13. It's hard to overemphasize the difference that Proposition 13 made. And what happened to CPEC is this. I don't think he'd mind me telling the story. Most people who know CPEC know the name Pat Callan. Pat Callan became director of CPEC in 1978, in February 1978, 3 months before Proposition 13. He always laughed and he said his timing was always very poor. Well, I was very concerned, as all of us were, that there would not be a CPEC or anything else left after Proposition 13 cut 60% of the state property tax revenues. I mean, it was going to be a disaster. But what Callan said, and this was just the two of us, but it turned out to be very, very prescient. He said, Bill, look, when things are good, when there's enough money, the legislature and the governor don't need a lot of advice on how to spend that money. They know how to spend the money. They're going to do it anyway, regardless of how you say it. But when the house is falling down, when the house is burning down, maybe a little guy with some ideas and some backbone. We had to take some very challenging stands. It wasn't just the data. We had to take some very controversial stands. Maybe a little guy's voice will rise above the status quo and rise above the establishment.
Give us some examples. You say some controversial, challenging stands. What were some of the issues that you grappled with? And
Absolutely, I'll be glad to do that. To impose a $50, it seems funny now, doesn't it? In 1983, the proposal was to have a $50 per semester charge at the community college, a state charge. They had fees at the community colleges before that, but that was the first time that there was going to be a charge of $50 with student financial aid provided, and CPEC supported that charge, not because, well, because there was really no other way of protecting the community colleges from what was going to be a ravaging back then. We did that at great risk. The legislature held our budget up for 2 months as a result of that, but I believe that, and our argument was, look, if we're going to have a charge, do it as part of a longer range plan, not just as part of a response to this fiscal crisis. It needs to be part of the fiscal crisis, but do a response that has these charges go up in a gradual, moderate, and predictable fashion. So come up with a policy about it. We came up with a policy called the price of admission, which was not only a model, but a policy. So there's one good example that got us into considerable political trouble, but I think came out correctly in the long run.
If I may, and some of this may sound disjointed, with regard to a statewide oversight committee, basically we don't have one. We don't have the data. When CPEC existed, it was rich in data, and Nancy is on the next panel. I can say straightforward, and I think she knows this, thank God for Nancy Shulock and the Institute, because the work she has done over the last few years is basically an awful lot of what CPEC should have been doing in the last few years. It no longer exists. There has been an absence, in my mind, of leadership from the colleges, universities, from the state, from the legislature. I'll drop a name, John Vasconcellos. He was somebody who had a passion about education. He was the primary mover of Pat Callan being involved and getting the head of that. We don't have any more John Vasconceleses in the legislature. There is a lack of a financial plan. How are we going to pay for this? And let me just throw out a couple of things. In 1960, the percentage of this general fund going to the University of California and the state colleges at that time was 60% of their budget. Today, in the University of California, it's between 8 to 11%. And I'm sorry, and this is a bias I have, for the legislature to significantly reduce access to these colleges and universities and then start making demands on the University of California when it's such a small, it's all relative, but such a small investment. Somebody's got to speak up, and there's nobody really yelling about it. And again, I'm also disappointed that instead of a CPEC or an organization like that providing the legislature and everybody with independent data to have, I'll get killed for this, to have the governor to work out the budget specifically with the president of the University of California. You talk about micromanagement. I mean, this goes beyond even what was going on back in the late 50s. So there are many issues with regard to politics, with regard to leadership, and also, by the way, there's lots of politics within higher education
So
itself.
I've heard, yeah.
And with all due diligence to express something, I have been on both sides of the table. I worked in the chancellor's office for 30 years on the other side of the table to CPEC before I ended up going there. UC and CSU in particular were as much responsible for the demise of the coordinating body, because if they didn't like it, what was coming out, they would push back with the legislators.
Oh,
big
end run
time. And if you take a look, I think when Bill was head of CPEC, you had 50, 60 members. When I left, there were, in 2002, we had 18 members and a budget that was minuscule. And it's from the budget and everything else. All of that was happening.
And just another couple of comments, because Dave has introduced some comments I wanted to make, and I'll just be short-spoken on this one, is that as CPEC progressed, among the things that it did, it tried to work cooperatively with all the systems. So as it was looking at data and beginning to make recommendations, it would ask them all to sit down with them, and they would never take immediate action. They'd have an information discussion first and say, these are the kind of recommendations we are likely to make to the governor and to the legislature. And next month, we'll come back and talk about this again and then decide whether we'll go forward. What would happen is that because the commission was comprised of representatives from the governing board of each of the segments, they said, oh, you know, CPEC's recommendations might be well received. You know what, we're going to do this now. And then when we meet a month later, and then we put together recommendations and we sent it over to the legislature, they said, that does sound good, CPEC. Their staff would look into it and says, you know, CPEC is not doing anything constructive. UC is already doing what they're recommended. They're just friends of the system. They're not acting on behalf of the state of California. And that process where we always wanted to meet with the people that we were making recommendations about before we formalize it and go to the governor and the legislature gave them the opportunity in time to be able to put CPEC in a dysfunctional position because they aren't going to recommend something that we aren't already doing. And that, coupled with the fact that we were getting less funding during the recessionary periods of the state, some of the best talented people were no longer with CPAC. And the strength that I mentioned earlier in talking about it, that not only did we give them data, we also gave them the analysis and interpretation of it. We began to just give them data, no analysis. And then we had wonderful people who were working within the various sectors, like Nancy, who did the research and did the analysis. They offered recommendations what ought to be done. That made it easier for legislators and the governor to say, well, CPAC really isn't that useful. We got institutions that we fund who do what they should be doing. And it made it easier for Governor Jerry Brown to simply say, we don't need them anymore.
And when did it formally go away?
2011.
I see. Oh, so
4
quite
years
recently.
ago, in 75. I think the lesson is this.
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second, just to say to all you something I should have said earlier, which is that we're going to welcome some questions from you, so be thinking of them in a minute. I have a few more for those, and then we'll turn it over to you in a minute, but just so you're ready. Sorry.
Just very briefly,
Yeah.
the master plan is not self-enforcing. I mean, that's really the lesson, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it takes an independent entity that's respected, that's data-driven, hopefully data-driven, and has some policy expertise and sophistication to command respect, not just with the legislature or the governor's staff, but also with the institutions. It seems to me that's the real lesson from CPAC.
Like Texas.
Like Texas.
How?
Texas has a very effective body.
Really?
Forget the politics and everything else. Texas.
Forget the Texas.
Right. That's the rare praise you hear for Texas around here.
A great coordinating board.
Yeah.
Did Pat Brown, I mean, I'm curious, maybe in your research, his reflections on the master plan later in life, as tuition began to be charged and whatnot, was he disappointed in how this played out?
He was so upset.
Really?
And in his oral history, and I'm glad you mentioned the oral histories that are out there, for any students who are doing research, it is a fantastic resource and an insight. My grandfather was an incredibly candid human being, and he was very candid in his interviews, so they're really fun to listen to, and he gets chatty with the interviewer, and it's quite fun. But in any event, there's a section where he talks about Prop 13, and it was, I think, a week or 2 weeks before the vote when it was being discussed, and he saw it all coming. He said, this is going to radically change our state, and it did. And I think there's a moment in the film where he says, we're 25 years ahead. Well, now I think we're past that place, and now we're falling 20 years behind. And I think Karen Bass makes a really great point of, we want the best, but we don't want to pay for it. And I think the first thing my grandfather did when he was elected is he raised taxes. And that's not a popular thing to say. I don't emphasize it in the film. But I think it's really important for people today to understand that these public services, our roads, our schools, the infrastructure, it comes from funding. And right now we're just cut off at the knees. So I thought it was a really interesting point about, when there is money, we don't need advice on how to spend it. We're going to figure that out. But it's been a really challenging time.
And people need to understand that when Prop 13 was under discussion, the Board of Regents voted no. The State University Board of Trustees voted no. The junior colleges voted yes. And they saw this as a wealth of new economy. Hey, folks, take a look. How has that worked out?
Right.
And I mean, that's part of the politics and some more of important background.
What about, as you look back on the experience of both the development and the execution of the master plan and its oversight by CPAC and others, are there things that you would have done differently with the benefit of hindsight now? Were there oversights, were there mistakes, or did this play out the way you wanted it to? You want to start?
Well, from my perspective, and again, part of the advantage is I started a little later than my colleagues did, because I didn't join CPAC until '89. But one of the things that I would have done differently is I would have changed the state mission. is not just about access to post-secondary education, it's about access and success. We want to make sure that all the folks that we admit get the support services and the assistance they need to succeed, particularly among UC and the state universities, where we eliminate 88% of the world if you want to go to UC. These are the best and the most, and students from the wealthiest families. And at the time that I joined CPEC, only 45% earned a baccalaureate degree within 4 years.
Wow.
And the only reason is because I started looking at the data that CPEC was receiving from them all the time, and we decided to go public with it. And that forced UC to begin to look at itself and look at its own data, and they began to make some changes and improve the percentages that were earning degrees within 5 years. And that was, I thought, one of the things that we missed when we created the master plan for 1960, is all we did was get them access, and we were 100% successful there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all you had to do was live to be 18 and keep breathing and have a mind that could benefit, and you could go to college.
Right.
And so if we went to the next step and said, and also succeed once you get there, then we had to have faculty be concerned about, do I understand whether my students are understanding what I'm saying? They wait till the final exam and the students don't do well and they flunk them. And then the students begin to drop out. We also were not well spoken. We talked about 2-year colleges and 4-year colleges. On average, it took you 4 years to earn an associate degree at a junior college. And from the mindset of a student, I went to college. This is my 4th year. I still got another year before I get an associate degree. Am I smart enough to be in college? That began to change, because the other thing I started sharing with folks when we were looking in the 90s about, you know, do we need to revise the master plan, is that when we talk about quality education, we need to say it is teaching and learning. Not just because you have 100% PhD teachers and no evidence that students have benefited from that. You also have to understand that students have to apply themselves. So what kind of things do we do with them through our counselors or through our faculty interaction that says, as a student, one of the things you need to do is learn how to take notes, learn how to study, learn how to ask questions when you don't understand what I'm saying, so that you can begin to communicate effectively with each other, not just lecture.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would provide some encouragement for our educational institution leaders to begin working with their faculty and saying, do you have any idea why Dr. Rice students are doing better than Dr. Ratliff students?
Mm-hmm.
No, Dr. Ratliff never talks to Dr. Rice, so he doesn't know. But if you had that as a mission, then the legislators and the governors would be looking not just at how many people are showing up and enrolling in our colleges, but are they, in an efficient manner, also completing their educational goals and objectives and earning degrees and or certificates. So one of the things, to directly answer your question and shut my mouth, is that I would say that one of the things that we ought to be looking at today is looking at a much more collaborative system where we are interested in both access and success at all levels, K-12 through. And if you admit the top 1/3 of students and 58% of them need remediation in English or mathematics, and then the only thing you want to do is blame high schools, but you won't accept the fact that the credentials and the training was provided by CSU and UC for every teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But Jim, the greatest deficiency of the master plan was, I agree with that, by the way, was it is an extremely expensive set of commitments.
Yeah.
If you really look at each of those, it's extremely expensive. Now, I think Pat Brown and the others understood that. They were very sophisticated. The problem is we never had a plan B. When sooner or later the piper had to be paid, and he or she did at some time, either because of Proposition 13 or economic downturns, the state had no plan B. And it was just an ad hoc. Every time it came up, well, we'll double fees. We won't call them tuition anymore, We'll double fees. So we've just ad hoc'd it every time we've had the bill come due for the expensive set of commitments. But the state has been reluctant to ever say one of these commitments needs to go away or it needs to be changed substantially.
And what would that be? I mean, if you were to abandon one of these commitments, is there a commitment that you would throw over the side?
Now, that's not a fair thing.
Fair enough. Okay, I'll let you off the hook on that one. If you come up with one, let us know.
Right. There isn't one, let's put it
Yeah, I
that
hear
way.
you.
There would have to be several.
At the outset, I mentioned there were some parallels between the 50s and now.
Right.
As far as I can tell, the last governor who set out and articulated goals for the state was Pat Brown. Water, transportation, higher education, investment. Somebody tell me what the goals are coming out of the leadership, quote unquote, of the state, congressional types and so forth, legislators and so forth. There's no articulation of what do we expect other than ad hoc, and it's a real problem. All of the reviews of the master plan have made recommendations. If you take a look at extensive work, some of it fantastic work, how many of their recommendations became acted upon, both from a goal standpoint, a mission standpoint, a success standpoint, and more importantly, a financial standpoint? Very few, probably less than 10%. Nancy, you probably bring that up a little bit, but none of the recommendations about how to fix and modify and keep up with the times that are changing. I mean, if you take a look, when the master plan statute was implemented, 90% of the population in the state was white. Not anymore. The other thing that bothers me, this is a sidebar, the people that have benefited from the vision and the activities of the master plan and educational opportunity, et cetera, are now our legislators. Look, excuse me, how come you're making it so difficult for the newer generations to pass through? And I'll just put out one other thing, and this isn't a direct thing. I am significantly, substantially, and I don't know how to address this, concerned about the University of California and its efforts at some of the campuses to privatize higher education, both at UCLA, UC San Francisco, and up at Berkeley. Excuse me, who the hell provided the funds, the land? I mean, we're talking about, it's a land-grant institution, federal money, federal land, and so forth. It's our taxpayers' money. How can you have a private institution, and I'll pick on UCLA for just a moment, you can push back. How can you, the Graduate School of Management there, supposedly going private, it's on state land, federal land, et cetera, et cetera. Their brand is a result of not only their good work, but the investment of the people of the state of California.
And yet, what should they do in this era of diminishing state support for the institution? Is there really an alternative?
Well, what they're doing, I'm not talking now about...
I'm at UCLA now, so I'm obliged to disagree with you.
But take a look at the undergraduate new students. 30% UCLA, between 29 and 30% at Berkeley, UCLA, and UC San Diego are out-of-state and foreign students. Big tuition, and that's one of the payoffs. I'm not saying it's right, but if UCLA and these schools want to be what the people of the state think they should be, the people of the state also need to knock on doors and put out some more money.
Agreed. Right. Audience members, who has a question?
And don't kill me.
we have a microphone that we're going to pass to you so that we can get you in the recording. So who has that microphone? Oh, here comes Rafe.
Is it up here?
I think, is it here? Oh, okay.
You want mine?
We can probably hear if somebody does have a question.
Yeah, I think it's easier for the tape if we get the person on. Okay, so let's see. I saw it right here, right in front. Yeah. Oh, sure, of course. It's your conference. You can ask a question.
Just a quick question. Again, this has been a great conversation. What I'm taking from this is it sounds like you laid out a number of the principles of the master plan, and it sounds like we're not following many of those. The no tuition promise is, of course, violated. The coordinating council or CPEC is gone. We don't restrict CSU to not offering doctorates. So I guess the question is the master plan obsolete in the sense it's been 54 years and it doesn't address our needs and we have to ultimately deviate from that blueprint, which is so old? Or is the master plan something we should try and get back to?
I can't speak to the exact particulars of the master plan, but the Constitution is rather old as well. So I think there's always an opportunity for amendments and reinterpretations, but I think the key point right now is there's no teeth. It's a vision and maybe stripped of a lot of its particularities even in the bill itself originally, but I think without funding and real oversight, it doesn't matter what it is, really.
If you take a look, it's the other part of the title is Master Plan for Higher Education in California, 1960 to 1975. Okay, the reviews that have occurred have all been an effort to move it forward, if you will. Not necessarily the master plan as people think of it, but tweak it and change it. Right now, I would argue there is no master plan. If you take a look at the what UC and CSU are supposed to be doing as it relates to the admission pool of 1/8, 1/3, that's really off the table. And other of the specifics not being followed. Take a look. You now have community college people can shoot me. You've now got 15 community colleges able to offer on a, quote, trial basis. Last time I looked, trial basis ended up being reality. 15 are now going to be able to offer the doctorate.
Baccalaureate. Baccalaureate, exactly.
They're working on it.
Not quite baccalaureate.
This is a tough crowd.
Yeah. Thank you.
I like it. They know.
Yeah, right.
You've got CSU now able to do the same, very similar things. So all of it is I would argue, let's start again.
But I think the point is this: CPEC would have been the forum for the discussion of this issue. In fact, has been the forum for the discussion of giving the CSU independent doctorate. I've got some scars on my back from when I was director of CPEC. We opposed giving an independent standalone authority to CSU to grant the doctorate back then. I later came to support it, but that is exactly the forum, a public forum, a forum in which many voices would be heard, and a forum in which the issues would be structured according to data, not simply political issues. That's the difference.
Yes.
Yes, that's the short answer. Okay, yes, to you.
Hi, my name's Kevin Cook. I work in higher ed at PPIC and always looking for independent data on higher ed. That would be great. But Senator Liu has a bill going through, I think it just passed the Senate, that would actually reestablish some form of CPEC. There's been pretty significant pushback from all three systems and the governor as to its creation. I'm just wondering, I don't know if you guys, I don't know the specifics of it, but what would you imagine it would look like? Would it look similar as it did before? And where would it live? Would it live as a part of the legislature? Would it live as part of the executive branch? Just curious, if we were to establish some new form of CPEC, what would it look like, and maybe what would it what would its main goals be?
One of the things that Dr. Liu, Senator Liu was doing with her bill is that she was taking some of the recommendations that were in the 2002 master plan recommendation and talked about building a collaborative system of education that would be coherent pre-K through university, and that they would be working together throughout. The advantage of if the governor were receptive to it or the legislature was would be similar to the Donahoe Act, that in 1960 they introduced a legislation that covered all of the aspects in the plan, not just a piece of it that I could write as a senator and get the governor to sign off on and say how great I was as a senator. They needed to look at the entire plan and understand that if you can put together a blueprint and you want it to operate throughout the state, you need to understand every decision has an impact on the rest of the system. So talk about putting it all together so it would work in alignment with each other. And that's what Carol was trying to do this year, and she just did not get support from her legislative colleagues, and the governor did not want to do it either. But that would be something that I would be highly supportive of, is that as a state, if we're looking to get improvements and have a functional master plan again, that we not just take A, J, and Z in the plan, but we take A through Z and make sure we know which follows the other and which precedes the other and how they work together, so that as a state, our education system will work coherently and in alignment to produce positive outcomes for all citizens of the state of California. Because if you live to be 5 years old, you are required to go to public schools. We ought to hold standards of what to expect out of those schools so that they can be eligible to go to and succeed when they get to post-secondary education. That's not going to happen if the segments are all competing against each other rather than collaborating with each other. And that's what I would say is a positive direction to go.
Would you say that at its heyday that the master plan did deliver that educational system? The coherent, success-based, and not just access, but success, at its, you know, as I say, in its heyday, was the master plan successful in doing that?
It was reasonably successful, because remember, as I said it earlier, the mission was we want to broaden access, and we also defined differential access or qualifications to be in the top 1/3, the top 1/8. But all the K-12 schools were taught, you know, these are the courses that you need to do to qualify for UC, and these are the courses you need to teach to qualify for CSU. Before that, we simply taught courses. We didn't call them college prep courses. They were just English 1, 2, 3, 4. And when the master plan was adopted and began to be implemented, the conversation between them made the high school start saying, these are college prep English courses and math courses, not just arithmetic. And that part of it was successful in helping get more of them successful. The only part that was differential about it and unfortunate is that the teachers in our schools were not all equally qualified to do that. And I use me as an example so I won't be lying on anybody. I took a course called calculus in high school and went to Berkeley as a physics major rather, and found out that the calculus course I took was really trigonometry. And Berkeley had to reteach me everything, and it was really, really difficult, and it destroyed my mindset that, you know, I thought I was one of the best because I was the second highest GPA in my high school when I graduated, and found out I was in the bottom quartile at Berkeley. And so it was relearning stuff.
That's a rough day.
Jim, it was very successful for the first 15 years, really for the first 20 to 30 years. But of course, the voters in their wisdom passed Proposition 98. I mean, there was a series of the GAN expenditure limits, and you recall, obviously, all of those things. So fiscal crisis, as well as these voter initiatives, threw things into a cocked hat, right?
If I may make another comment, the league, as I understand it, statewide, is talking about a 3-year study. This was done in 9 months. Look at the vacuum and what's happening in the state right now. Please expedite the study.
Yes, over here. Please.
Yes, good morning. So I was fortunate enough to have receive 2 UC degrees at a time when it was dramatically cheaper. And I had a question about the increase in costs for the fees. And I recently read a book called The End of College by Kevin Carey, who pointed at, he's talking nationally across both public and private institutions, that the underlying reason why costs have gone up so much is the growth of the number of administrators. And I was wondering, is that true at UC and CSU as well, or is it, as most of us believe, and is the story that's portrayed in the press, and certainly by UC and CSU, is that the state support has declined so much? So I'm trying to understand where the truth really is.
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. President Covino, do you know the answer? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I would, I'm sorry, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, PPIC, we did a report, and yes, there are more administrators than maybe 20 years ago, but you look pre-recession to now, the growth in administrative costs has been
It's not that great.
So the main reason for the increase in tuition is a massive cut over the last 30 years of the state's support, not so much a growth in administrative costs and faculty salaries.
You want to come on up here for a little bit? No, I appreciate it.
Most of the campuses across the country that I've been visiting over the years, over the last 15 years, many of the demands by the federal government and state government is unfunded, but you have to do it. That's number one. And number two, whatever it is. And number two, it's the support staff that has been eliminated, so that I'm in agreement with you. I don't, to suggest that it's because of all these administrators, I think is misguided.
Sir.
I have a question, but I just did want to touch on that a little bit, being an administrator. Again, if you look back at the growth, as the funds from the state went down, fundraising became a big part of the CSU in particular. If you go back 15 to 20 years, fundraising was never seen as part of their purview. That was the purview of the private schools. So a lot of that management growth were on fundraisers. Technology did not have the same role 15, 20 years ago that it does now. And again, a lot of that management growth was on the technology side. So if you pull out the fundraisers and the technology and the administrative burdens put on by the feds and other entities, you'll find that, as was said, the management growth, really hasn't been what's, portrayed. But my question is, the master plan is being redefined. It seems that the current governor feels that that redefined model should be technology-based, that he's put money into technology. He believes that you can use technology to increase access, and there's a lot of debate on that. The CSUs and the UCs see the model as being redefined as a non-state reliant, because the dollars aren't there, looking at the non-resident out-of-state students to generate revenue, and the corporations who still have a lot of money are redefining the model as a do-it-yourself, that you see a lot of them doing a lot of their own educational programs at the advanced level. And I'm wondering, is there a way of, you don't have CPEC, but we still have people can call meetings together. I'm wondering, is there a way to sort of get the leaderships of the corporate world, the institutions, and the governor and others to begin talking about how these rethinking of the model either intersect or diverge? Because I do think that, someone mentioned that the kind of chaos that existed then is we're heading back into that direction. But it would seem to me that there should be some voices that could get together and talk about this, because again, the corporations have a lot of dollars and they have a lot of say on what their educational needs are.
More of a comment than a question, but response, yeah.
Just a quickie, and it's only because it's one of the things I wanted to share before you cut us off, because I want to be, well, I know you said we were going to try and be efficient.
No, I appreciate it.
We've got a couple more minutes, but one of the things that I really do believe is that the residents of the state of California are dramatically different than they were back in 1959. And as we do our planning and we talk and think about it, we need to change how our minds interpret that. The example I would like to share is that when we started trying to introduce technology, because so many of our young kids now are smartphone experts and tablet experts and stuff, and so they are very comfortable with the use of technology, but many of our faculty union leadership, not the union members, but the union leadership, feel that introduction of technology is a way to get rid of faculty, not to assist their abilities to be effective with students. And what we would like to try and encourage people to do is, think about it. We used to have just blackboards and chalkboards, and then we introduced videos and overhead projection screens. We didn't get rid of faculty. That just became an additional tool. And as we look at technology, we might want to talk about it as technology-assisted instruction, not just online education, that I could teach the entire country by doing it online. Now, you don't have to hire no faculty, you just have to use my online. We want technology-assisted, not faculty replacement technology. And that way we begin to recognize that our students come in with certain strengths and weaknesses. We want to make sure that our instructional part to enhance learning takes advantage of the strengths that we bring in with them and have the support services that addresses the weaknesses that we are aware of as those students come through, and that our faculty look at themselves as a team, not as individuals competing against legislators and other people like former CPECers who talk bad about them.
If on that same subject, I think higher education might take a look at what several school districts in the country are doing with the Khan Academy in terms of, as it relates to their curriculum, how they're teaching, and schools and school district people that I've talked to, primarily in other states, have viewed this as tremendous support and helping not only their students, but also how they teach, and none of them have complained. Actually, they're adding more teachers to utilize that whole thing. So I think there's some things that higher education can learn from K-12.
Certainly. We have time for one more. Who's got the
Hi, I was fascinated seeing the video clip of 60 years ago, what a campus looks like in California. And of course, it's very different now demographically, not only in terms of cultural and ethnic groups, but also age. And I was fascinated to learn that the late Governor Brown had not gone to college. So if we look at today's demographics in the state of California, we have a lot of people who are immigrants and maybe had degrees from other countries, but they come here and they can't practice what they learned somewhere else. Or we have people who were self-educated, like the former governor, and want to get higher degrees, but our systems don't really allow that because, and some of that may be federal regulations, but they can't come in and get degrees without jumping through all the other hoops. So I'm wondering whether in a new vision of what higher education looks like, that it might include people across all age groups, people who bring in life experience and what that would look like. So I was wondering whether any of these discussions come up.
I'm not a part of that discussion as a filmmaker, but I think it's a really great point. And I think building on the technology discussion that was happening, I think there's a really great opportunity to do more flip teaching where the digital or online learning can be the lecture that you watch, but then when you come to campus, you're engaged in a dialogue, because I think really one of the key challenges that's happening for young people today is they're really digitally savvy, but in terms of being able to engage in a conversation, to work collaboratively, or then follow independent research, any of these skills, you need the guidance of a mentor. And so I think that there's a great opportunity for maybe more individualized mentorships and guidance and teaching in that way. And I wanted to just add, I feel so optimistic about this. We've taken a hit. It's feels really, again, chaotic, but I think it's a really amazing opportunity because we have so many more tools and so many more people at the table. I think that we're headed for something really exciting.
If I may, in response partially, this is close to home to me. Among other things, I work with, I'm paying it forward, if you will, with students and their parents. Within the last week, a young woman has a bachelor's degree in biology from a university in the Philippines. High honors, etc., accredited there, accredited here, and so forth. Wants to get a nursing degree at, and is anybody here from Long Beach State? Wants to get her nursing degree from Long Beach State. Met last week. Nothing that she has taken at the Philippine University, she has to start all over again in terms of biology and so forth. I'm sorry, but this, I can also say about transfer students, I mean, one of the problems with some of the transfer students that I've been working with who want to transfer from the California community colleges, having a very difficult time understanding their admission requirements for the UC and CSU. They don't know how to access the information and so forth. I'm not minimizing all the efforts out there. There still are a lot of students who are having a very difficult time. And if I may just add one other thing, most of my students are high school students and their parents. And Pat Colby over here will understand where I'm coming from because I've already said this before. The lack of high school, college advisors, counselors who have gone out to, been among the first cuts. Students who should be able to go to and are eligible, in my mind, to go to UC or CSU are being told go to community colleges. I'm talking about kids who have 2,200 on the SAT, who are 4.2 students from some of the top high schools in the state of California. And a high school counselor says, what do you mean you want to go to UC? Forget that, go to a community college. And the latest one has been accepted at 2 UC campuses and also had been told, don't take the SAT, take the ACT, you can get in any place. I'm sorry, that's all part of the problem that needs to be addressed, pursuant, if you will, to the question and comment that you made.
I'd like to just briefly respond there too, because Sasha said it. There's a lot of reason to be optimistic. I think we've got a lot of the pieces together. It's very clear what we don't have is political leadership. We don't have a Pat Brown, bluntly speaking. And we don't have the kind of leaders that were back then. Now, that doesn't mean we have to have them exactly like that, but all the ingredients are there. We have an outstanding system of higher education in this state. I mean, you travel around. We have a wonderful system of higher education in this state. It's got its problems. It has many problems, some of which we've covered, others not. But the ingredients is there. We must have political leadership. Nancy Shulock's latest work shows this in other states. Who are the major engineers of many of the reforms in other states? It's the political leadership. It's the governor.
Well, I get to have the last word, and I hope you all will join me in thanking these members of this panel, not just for their service here, but for the work that they've done on behalf of the state of California. Thank you. I believe you have a 15-minute break, and we'll be back here afterward. Thank you all.